There is a number that has crossed centuries carrying a unique reputation. 666. For many people today, the meaning seems self-evident. It is the number of the beast, a sign linked to the end of times. For some, even a literal mark that could one day identify followers of a system malignant. This reading has become so familiar that another question rarely arises. But there is a curious issue hidden in the text that mentions this number. A simple question. What did early readers understand when they first saw this number? Time. The number appears in one of the best-known passages of Revelation in chapter 13. There, after describing a symbolic figure associated with the power of the beast, the text presents a peculiar challenge. Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, because it is a man's number. Your number is 666. The word used there is significant. Calculate. Don't observe. Don't wait. Not recognizing in the future. Calculate. It may seem like a small detail, but it is precisely at this point that the story begins to open up, because calculating a number suggests something specific. There is a riddle to be solved, and riddles usually presuppose two things. First, that there is a method to resolve them. Second, that someone can arrive at the answer. This raises an intriguing possibility. Perhaps the number 666 was not just presented as a mysterious symbol of the distant future. Perhaps, for the first readers of the text, it was a code that could be deciphered. And if this hypothesis is taken seriously, another question arises almost immediately. Code for what? For an event? For a system? Or for someone? The detail that further complicates the issue is in the text's own sentence. It's a man's number. This expression has provoked many interpretations throughout history. Some understand it as a reference to human imperfection. Others see it as a symbolic way of describing opposition to God. But there is a third possibility that, to many longtime readers, seemed quite plausible. The idea that the number could be linked to a name. This hypothesis may sound strange to anyone reading the text today. But in the world in which Revelation was written, numbers and names were much more close to what we imagine. In fact, in many ancient cultures, letters also functioned as numbers. This created something curious. A name could be transformed into a numeric value, and a number could hide a name. When this type of reasoning appears in ancient texts, it often produces exactly what we see here, an invitation to calculate. But before moving on to any attempt at a solution, it's worth pausing, because there is a detail that often goes unnoticed. Today, when people hear the number 666, they usually think of a single interpretation. But that didn't always happen. In fact, throughout history, the meaning of this number has changed several times. At times, he was treated as a political enigma. In others, as a moral symbol. Later, as a religious identification. And in more recent times, it has even become associated with global technologies and systems. Each of these readings emerged in different contexts. Each answered questions specific to their time, and each tried to explain the same enigmatic phrase. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast. So perhaps the most interesting question isn't just what the number means. Perhaps the most revealing question is another. How did a single number manage to take on so many different meanings throughout of history? To understand this, we need to go back to the world in which the text was written. A world where numbers were not just quantities. Sometimes they were messages hidden in plain sight. And it is exactly in this environment that the story of 666 really begins. To understand why the text of Revelation 13 invites the reader to calculate a number, it is, I need to take a step back and observe something that seems strange to us today, but which was quite common in the ancient world. For centuries, many cultures did not separate letters and numbers the way they did. We do today. In modern systems, numbers have their own symbols. 1, 2, 3, 4. But in much of the ancient world, the system worked differently. The letters of the alphabet themselves also represented numerical values. In Hebrew, for example, each letter had a value. In Greek, the same principle also existed. This created a curious consequence. Any word could be converted into a number, and any number could be reconstructed as a combination of letters. It may seem like just a technicality of ancient writing, but this detail made room for something that became quite popular in certain intellectual circles of the ancient world. The practice that today we call gematria. The logic of gematria was simple. If each letter has a numerical value, then the total value of a word can be calculated adding the values of each letter. Thus, names, titles, and expressions could generate specific numbers. This type of calculation was not necessarily treated as magic or superstition. In many cases, it functioned as a sophisticated form of intellectual play, a kind of linguistic puzzle. In some contexts, this resource also serves something more strategic: communicate a message indirectly. In the Roman world, especially in environments where political criticism could bring dangerous consequences, hiding names through numbers was not unthinkable. In fact, there are ancient inscriptions in which people recorded phrases like, "I love the one whose number is," the number replaced the name. Anyone who knew the method could reconstruct the identity. Anyone who didn't know would just see a seemingly random number. This type of reasoning helps to illuminate a curious detail in the text of Revelation. When the author writes, "Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast," he is not simply describing a symbol, he is proposing an interpretative challenge. And for readers familiar with letter-number systems, this kind of challenge made sense. It was an invitation to apply a known method: add letters, test names, search for matches. It is interesting to note that the text does not present the number as something impossible to measure, understand. On the contrary, he suggests that someone with understanding could come up with an answer. This detail can change the way we see the passage, because if the number can be calculated, it is no longer just an abstract symbol. It starts to function as a potentially decipherable enigma. But here, an inevitable question arises. If the first readers had the cultural tools to try to solve this enigma, did anyone try? The answer appears to be yes. In fact, already in the first centuries after the circulation of the Apocalypse, different readers began to propose solutions for the number 666. Some believed they had found names that fit the calculation perfectly. Others suggested alternatives, and each new proposal tried to explain the same central question: who or what could be hiding behind that number? The result was something that might surprise those who imagine that there has always been a single answer to that question. From very early on, several different possibilities emerged. Some pointed to well-known political figures. Others tried to identify religious enemies. Still others treated the number in a more symbolic way. In other words, the invitation to calculate the number did not just produce a solution. He opened a series of attempts, and it is precisely in these first attempts that we begin to realize something important. The number 606 was never just a number. From the beginning, it functioned as a meeting point between interpretation, context, historical, and theological imagination. And it was in this space that the first answers began to emerge. When the apocalypse began to circulate among first and second Christian communities century, the enigma of the number 666 did not go unnoticed. The text had done something unusual. He didn't just mention a symbolic number. He explicitly invited the reader to calculate it. And when an ancient text poses such a challenge, it is almost inevitable that someone will try. Resolve it. That's exactly what happened. Throughout the first centuries of the Christian era, different interpreters began to propose possible solutions to the puzzle. Some of these attempts have come down to us through preserved writings of the so-called patristic, the period of early Christian thinkers. And something curious appears when we examine these old discussions. There was no single dominant response. In fact, there were several competing hypotheses. Some interpreters believed the number hid the name of a historical figure. Specific. One of the best-known proposals pointed to the Roman Emperor Nero. This hypothesis became particularly interesting because of a linguistic detail. When the name Nero Caesar is written in Hebrew and the numerical values of its letters are added together, the result can reach the number 666. To many modern scholars, this mathematical coincidence suggests that some readers, ancients, may have seen the number as an indirect reference to the emperor, especially since the memory of Nero's government had left deep marks on Christian communities. During his reign, persecutions against Christians were recorded in Rome, and his figure came to be remembered as a symbol of power, hostile to the Christian movement. But Nero was not the only hypothesis. Other interpreters have suggested that the number could point to Emperor Domitian, whose administration was also seen by some Christians as oppressive. Other proposals emerged over time, associating the number with different names or to specific titles linked to imperial power. Each attempt followed the same basic principle. Choose a name, convert letters to numbers, add the values. If the result reached 606, the hypothesis seemed to gain strength. This process reveals something important about the way the text was read. Ancient interpreters were treating the number as a real riddle. They weren't just reflecting on the symbolism of the number, they were trying to find out who could be hiding there. However, as different names were proposed, a problem began to arise. Appear. More than one name seemed to work. Depending on the way the letters were written or transliterated, different calculations could lead to the same result. This created a curious scenario. The method worked, but the answers were not unique. In other words, number 666 began to generate something that rarely appears in modern popular interpretations: open interpretative debate. Some Christian thinkers of the period came to recognize this difficulty. A well-known example comes from Irenaeus of Lyon, a second-century theologian. When commenting on the number of the beast, Irenaeus mentioned different names that could correspond to the calculation. But instead of declaring a definitive solution, he adopted a cautious stance. According to him, it was more prudent to wait for the future fulfillment of the prophecy before assert any specific identification. This kind of caution reveals something interesting. Even among interpreters who accepted the calculation method, there was awareness that the riddle was not simple. The number seemed to point to something or someone, but the text didn't provide all the information, and this had an unexpected effect. Instead of closing the discussion, the number kept it open. Over the following centuries, new interpretations would continue to emerge. Some would insist on the idea of a hidden name. Others would begin to see something different in the number, maybe not a code to identify a specific person, perhaps a broader symbol, a symbol that expressed something about power, imperfection, or opposition to the divine. And it is exactly at this point that the history of interpretation begins to take another turn. Because at some point, the focus stops being just who is hiding in the number, and it becomes what the number represents. In the early centuries, as we have seen, many readers treated the number 666 as a kind of historical enigma. The central question was straightforward. What name could be hidden there? But as time progressed, one difficulty began to become more and more difficult, evident. The suggested names changed, calculations varied, and no proposal could definitively end the discussion. This scenario produced a slow but significant interpretative shift. Gradually, some interpreters began to look at the number in another way. Perhaps the purpose of the text was not to provide a precise code to identify a specific ruler. Perhaps the number had been presented as a symbol of something greater. This type of reading began to gain space, especially when Christianity entered in a new historical phase. In the following centuries, the relationship between the Church and the Roman Empire underwent profound transformations. In the beginning, Christian communities often lived in contexts of political tension. But from the 4th century onwards, with the conversion of Emperor Constantine and the progressive institutionalization of Christianity in the Roman world, the scenario changed. The Church stopped being just a marginal movement and began to occupy a space central in society. This historical change also altered the reading horizon of many biblical texts. Passages that previously seemed to speak directly about imperial persecutions began to be reread within a different context. And in this new environment, the number 666 began to receive more symbolic interpretations and theological. Some thinkers began to observe a structural detail of the number. In biblical tradition, certain numbers carry symbolic meanings. The number 7, for example, often appears associated with the idea of fullness or perfection. Within this symbolic logic, the number 6 could represent something incomplete, something that approaches perfection but does not reach it. When this logic is applied to 6.Across, an interesting reading emerges. The number could represent an intensified form of imperfection, a repetition that amplifies the idea of fallen humanity or power that presents itself as absolute but remains incomplete. Instead of pointing directly at a specific name, the number would start working as a symbolic description of a type of power, a human power that tries to take the place of the divine. This interpretation has not entirely eliminated attempts to decipher the number as a code, but she began to offer an alternative. Instead of just asking who is, some interpreters began to ask what represents. This shift did not happen abruptly. During late antiquity and the Middle Ages, different forms of reading continued coexisting. Some commentators have maintained an interest in possible historical identifications. Others increasingly emphasize the symbolic character of the number within the narrative of the apocalypse. In this type of reading, 666 became less of a mathematical puzzle and more of a symbolic portrait of the poorly structured and human systems. This type of approach was in dialogue with a broader trend in biblical interpretation. Medieval. Many apocalyptic texts were read not only as literal predictions of events' futures, but also as spiritual representations of conflicts between good and evil present throughout history. Thus, the number of the beast could be seen as an expression of human powers that organize in a way that is contrary to the values of the kingdom of God. It is interesting to note that at this point in history, the number was not yet linked to the idea of a future literal brand. This association, so common in modern discussions, did not yet dominate the horizon interpretative. In fact, for much of Christian history, 666 circulated primarily among two possibilities, or it was treated as a riddle related to historical characters, or was it interpreted as a broader theological symbol about the nature of power human in opposition to God. And this coexistence of interpretations shows something important. The number continued to fascinate, but its meaning was still in motion, and it was precisely when new religious tensions emerged in Europe that the number 666 gained an unexpected function. It is no longer just an ancient enigma or a theological symbol, and it started to become something different, an identification tool in intense religious conflicts. For many centuries, as we have seen, the number 666 remained within two large interpretative paths. For some readers, it functioned like a code to be deciphered. For others, he represented a theological symbol of human power in opposition to divine. These two readings coexisted for a long period. But at the beginning of the modern era, a new scenario began to emerge in Europe, and this scenario would profoundly change the way the number of the beast would be used. The 16th century marked the beginning of one of the greatest religious conflicts in the history of Western Christianity, the Protestant Reformation. When figures like Martin Luther, John Calvin, and other reformers began to questioning structures and practices of the medieval church, the debate quickly expanded to the field of biblical interpretation. Prophetic and apocalyptic texts began to be read within this new context of religious dispute. Passages that were previously treated as general symbols of evil or ancient riddles began to be interpreted as direct descriptions of the religious tensions of the present. It was in this environment that the number 6666 gained an unexpected role. Some reformers began to apply images of the apocalypse to institutions and leaders that they considered corrupt or deviant. Among these interpretations, an idea emerged that would become quite influential in that period: the association between the figure of the beast and, by extension, the number 666 with the papacy. This reading was part of a larger set of interpretations known as historicists. Within this model, the book of Revelation did not just describe events concentrated in the end of times. He narrated, in symbolic language, the history of the church over the centuries. In this interpretative scheme, different symbols of the apocalypse were associated with historical events or specific institutions. The figure of the beast then came to be seen by some Protestant interpreters as representation of a religious system that, in his view, had moved away from the origins of Christianity. And the number 6666 began to be used as part of this argument. Some authors have tried to apply the numerical calculation method again, the same type of reasoning that had been used centuries before, to associate number with titles linked to the papacy. One of the best-known proposals involved the Latin title Vicarius Filii Dei, sometimes cited in debates of the period. When assigning numerical values to the Roman letters present in the expression, some interpreters, they argued that the result reached 6 by 6. This type of calculation was used in controversial treatises and religious debates of the time. But the most important point here is not just the calculation itself. It is in the function that the number began to assume. For centuries, 666 had been treated as an enigma or symbol. Now it was being used as an argument in concrete religious disputes. In other words, the number began to play a role within a conflict-specific history. And this conflict did not go unanswered. Catholic theologians, responding to criticisms of the Reformation, also began to develop new ways of interpreting apocalyptic texts. Among these responses emerged models that would later become known as preterism and futurism. These approaches sought to shift the focus from Protestant interpretations. In the preterist model, for example, many elements of Revelation were understood as events linked to the world of the first century, often associated with the Empire Roman. In the futuristic model, on the other hand, the prophecies of the apocalypse were projected mainly for the future, associated with events that have not yet occurred. These new readings help to completely reconfigure the field of interpretation of the debate about the apocalypse is no longer just a symbolic or historical discussion. It became part of a field of structured theological disputes. And in this process, the number 666 also changed its position within the history of interpretation. Before, it mainly appeared as a mathematical puzzle, a theological symbol, an element within the apocalyptic narrative. After the Reformation, it also began to function as an interpretative marker in confessional debates. This moment represents an important turning point, because from then on, different Christian traditions began to develop systems complete reading of the apocalypse. And within these systems, the number 666 could take on very different meanings. In some contexts, it would remain linked to historical interpretations. In others, it would become part of broader symbolic narratives. But on one of these interpretative paths, a path that would develop with strength in the following centuries, the number would begin to gain a meaning that today it's extremely familiar. The idea that 666 would not just be a symbol or historical identification, but a literal mark associated with future events. This interpretation did not emerge immediately. It was formed gradually within a new theological and cultural environment that began to take shape in modernity. And when it finally gained traction, it would end up becoming one of the most readable popular numbers of number 666 in the contemporary world. After the intense interpretative disputes that marked the period of the Reformation, the field reading of the Apocalypse was no longer the same. New interpretive models were in circulation. Some continued to try to relate the book's visions to events in church history. Others argued that most of the prophecies had already been fulfilled in the ancient world. But throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, a third path began to gain strength. A reading that shifted the focus of most of the prophecies of the Apocalypse to a future not yet realized. This approach later became known as eschatological futurism. Within this model, many elements described in the book came to be understood as events concentrated in a specific period at the end of history. And it was in this interpretative environment that a detail from chapter 13 began to receive renewed attention. The text speaks of a mark associated with the authority of the beast, a mark that appears on the right hand or forehead and that would be linked to the ability to buy or sell. For much of the history of interpretation, this passage had been read in different ways, quite varied. Some commentators understood the mark as a symbol of spiritual loyalty. Others related it to social or religious practices of certain periods. Historical. But within the new futuristic horizon, the possibility of a more literal reading began gaining space. If Revelation describes future events, then perhaps this mark should also be understood as something concrete, something visible, something that could identify followers of a global system hostile to the kingdom of God. This interpretative change did not happen all at once. It was gradually formed within certain theological circles, especially in Anglo-Saxon Protestant environments. One of the important contexts for this transformation was the development of a system known as dispensationalism. This theological model organized biblical history into different periods, or dispensations, and proposed a very structured reading of the prophecies. Within this scheme, many interpreters began to see the book of Revelation as a detailed map of events that would still occur in the future. The figure of the beast would be a specific leader or political system that would emerge at the end of the history. And the number 666 would be linked to the identification of this power. In this new interpretative scenario, the number is no longer just a mathematical enigma or theological symbol. He became part of a much more concrete eschatological narrative, a narrative that involved global governments, control systems, identification of followers, events focused on the end times. This type of reading began to spread more strongly at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. 20th century, especially through study Bibles, prophetic conferences, and literature popular eschatology. An important example was the Schofield Reference Bible, published at the beginning of the 20th century, Kerex, which helped to spread dispensational interpretations among many readers of the Bible. From that moment on, the association between the number 666 and the idea of a literal brand future began to gain ground in the imagination of a large part of the Christian public. But there is a curious detail in this process. Even as this new interpretation became popular, other readings of the number continued to exist. Some scholars have maintained an interest in possible historical connections with the world Roman. Others continued to defend symbolic or theological readings of the number. In other words, the emergence of the futuristic interpretation did not eliminate the previous ones. He simply added a new layer to the history of interpretation, and this new layer would find in the 20th century a particularly receptive, because as the modern world advanced, new technologies, systems, global economic and communications networks have begun to transform the way people imagine the future. And in this rapidly changing scenario, number 666 was about to leave the field exclusive to theology. It would start appearing in an unexpected place: popular culture. Cinema, literature, technological theories, and public debates would start to incorporate the number as a recognizable symbol, even to people who had never read the text of the Apocalypse. And so it was that a number mentioned in an ancient apocalyptic book began to acquire a second life in the modern collective imagination. When the futuristic interpretation of the Apocalypse began to gain ground in the 19th centuries, and XX, the number 666, had already gone through a long interpretative trajectory. He had already been a possible code for a Roman ruler, a theological symbol of imperfect human power, an element used in religious disputes during the Reformation. But modernity has brought something new to this story. She placed the number within an environment that amplified symbols in an unprecedented way: mass culture. With the growth of the press, cinema, television, and later the internet, certain symbolic elements began to circulate far beyond academic or religious circles. The number 666 ended up entering this flow, and upon entering, it began to take on a life of its own. One of the areas where this has become particularly visible is in literature and cinema. During the 20th century, stories with apocalyptic themes began to explore the number as a recognizable narrative element. Films and novels often presented 666 as a sign of the presence of evil or of an antagonistic force associated with the end times. A well-known example came in the 1970s when the film The Omen presented the number 666 as a mark associated with the birth of a figure linked to the Antichrist. The narrative was fictional, but the cultural impact was real. Suddenly, a symbol taken from a biblical text began to be recognized by audiences much broader. People who had never studied Revelation began to associate the number automatically to ideas of evil, danger, or dark omen. This phenomenon reveals something interesting. The number 666 began to function as a cultural icon, a symbol that circulates regardless of the original context in which it appeared. But the influence of popular culture didn't stop at cinema or literature. As the technological world advanced, the number also began to appear in another type of debate: discussions about economic systems and emerging technologies. At the end of the 20th century, for example, some futurist interpretations began to associate the number of the beast to possible digital identification systems. Magnetic cards, barcodes, and other tracking technologies have reached to be mentioned in popular debates on the topic. These connections have not always emerged within formal academic studies. They often appeared on radio programs, popular books, or discussions, religious-oriented to the general public. But regardless of origin, they helped to consolidate a powerful association. For many people in the contemporary world, the number 666 has become automatically linked to ideas of global control, technology, and future events. This development shows how a symbol can cross different environments interpretative. First, he lives within a religious text. Then it goes through theological debates. Later, he entered the field of popular culture. And in this process, it accumulates new meanings. The curious thing is that at this moment in history, many people recognize the number 666 immediately, but they don't always know exactly where this association came from. For some, it remains a symbol linked to the end of times. For others, it is simply a number associated with horror or suspense stories. And for scholars of the biblical text, it remains one of the most discussed enigmas of the apocalyptic literature. What this root reveals is something interesting. The number 606 was not stuck in its original context. It became a symbol capable of circulating between different worlds, theological, cultural, and even technological. But when we observe this entire trajectory from the invitation to calculate the number to its presence in modern films and debates, a question inevitably returns. What exactly happened to the meaning of this number throughout history? Because when we look at each step of this journey, something becomes increasingly clear. The number remained the same, but the interpretations around him continued to change. If we look only at the text of Revelation 13, the number 666 appears briefly. One sentence, an invitation to calculate, and a riddle. But when we follow the trajectory of this number throughout history, we notice something that the text itself does not explain directly. The meaning attributed to it did not remain static. On the contrary, it went through different interpretative layers as the historical context changed. In the ancient world, where letters also functioned as numbers, many readers treated the 666 as a potentially decipherable code. The challenge seemed mathematical. Add letters, test names, try to find out who could be hiding behind the number. Some proposals pointed to Roman emperors. Others explored different possibilities. But the central point was always the same. The number seemed to invite the reader to solve a historical enigma. As the centuries passed, however, this approach began to coexist with another way of reading. Instead of just asking who might be hiding in the number, some interpreters they began to observe the numerical symbolism of the text itself. From this perspective, 666 could represent something broader, a symbolic way of describing human power that tries to present itself as absolute, but remains incomplete. The number stopped being just a code and started to function as an image theological. Later, amid the religious tensions of modern Europe, the number took on a new meaning.
This scalpel in particular
Function.
shows the advanced
He began to
understanding
appear
of Roman surgery.
in confessional
The
debate.
craftsmanship is exquisite.
Different interpretations of Revelation have been used to identify institutions, systems, or leaders within the conflicts of the time. At that moment, the number began to act as an interpretative marker within concrete religious disputes. But the story didn't stop there. In the following centuries, new eschatological models emerged. Especially within futuristic readings of Revelation, the number began to be associated with the idea of a literal mark linked to final events in history. This interpretation has become particularly influential in the modern world. And with the advancement of mass culture, the number ended up crossing another frontier. He left the exclusive field of biblical interpretation and entered popular culture. Today, the 666 appears in films, novels, cultural debates, and technological discussions. Many people immediately recognize the number even without knowing the context text in which it appeared. This root reveals something curious. The number remained exactly the same, but each historical period looked at it through different questions. For some long-time readers, the question was, who is hiding in that number? For later interpreters, the question became, what does this number symbolize? In contexts of religious dispute, the question changed again. To whom should this symbol be applied? And in the contemporary world, another possibility often arises. How could this number appear in the future? These different questions produced different answers, and each answer helped shape the way successive generations imagined the world. Meaning of the number. Perhaps this is exactly why the 666 continues to attract so much interest. It is not just a detail within that of an ancient text. It became a meeting point between history, interpretation, and imagination. A small number that spanned centuries being reinterpreted in contexts completely different. And when we observe this entire trajectory, something becomes clear. The text remained the same. But the way people tried to understand that number changed over and over again. Times throughout history.